2020. It will be 400 years since a group of colonists set sail for America on the ship the Mayflower and established the Plymouth Colony there. Today we know these migrants as the Pilgrims. What many people don't know is that the Pilgrims' journey went through Leiden, then the second largest city in the Dutch Republic. In the United States, the Pilgrims are considered important founders of American identity, while the romanticized version of their arrival has found less support by many Americans and Native Americans in recent years. The Leiden chapter of their story has, however, seldom been told, even though the city had a great influence on the religious refugees. Leiden was a melting pot. In the 17th century, 2/3 of its inhabitants came from abroad. Leiden became Europe's leading producer of cloth. Leiden's population had doubled in only a short period of time. It was a dynamic city, with an unprecedented freedom of speech and worship for its time. It was located in the young Dutch Republic and was governed by the wealthy merchants and regents of that day. In the early 17th century, the English pastor John Robinson and his some 100 followers were looking for somewhere outside of England to practice their faith. Following the example of Calvin, the Pilgrims believed in the doctrine of predestination. Only their God could determine their fate, which is why they were unable to accept the authority of the English king, James I, which exposed them to fear of persecution, leading them to flee England. The Pilgrims first traveled to Amsterdam, but there they experienced such violent disagreements with their supposed allies that Robinson and his followers decided to find a new life elsewhere. The Pilgrims took their regular ferry service from Amsterdam over the Haarlemmermeer to Leiden. The Pilgrims arrived via the river, the Zeil. As they approached the city, this is roughly what they would have seen. On the 1st of May, 1609, the Pilgrims arrived in the city center of Leiden. The mooring spot in front of the Waag, or wayhouse, was the terminus for the ferry services. Newcomers like the Pilgrims were welcomed in the city. The textile industry was flourishing, and workers were in high demand. Textile workers mainly worked from home. Women spent long days at the spinning wheel and looked after the children and the home. Children helped with the sorting of the wool. Almost half of the Pilgrims found work as weavers, fullers, carders, or combers. It was hard work for very little pay. At that time, Leiden was a haven for Protestant refugees from abroad and was known throughout Europe for its tolerant university. Bookshops and printers sold publications that were banned in other countries. The Pilgrims learned a lot during their time in Leiden. At the university, Pastor John Robinson took part in fierce but open discussions about the true doctrine of the Protestant faith. At the engineering school, Miles Standish, the Pilgrims' military leader, learned about bombardment techniques, stronghold construction, and land surveying. The weaver Samuel Fuller attended medical lessons at the university's anatomical theater, and so became the Pilgrim surgeon. In the 11 years that the refugees spent in Leiden, they gained new administrative insights. They felt, for example, that the state shouldn't interfere with the church. In England, you could only get married in the state church. In the Netherlands, only a civil wedding was legally valid. The church's blessing was entirely separate. The Pilgrims took this Dutch separation of church and state with them to America. The Pieterskerk in Leiden was an important place for the Pilgrims. Those who understood Dutch sometimes attended public services there. They also held their baptism, marriage, and funeral ceremonies there. Robinson had a large residence here where the Pilgrims gathered to practice their faith and discuss Bible texts. This area became known as the English Gate. Some 300 Pilgrims lived nearby. Robinson himself wouldn't join his religious followers on their next chapter. When he died in 1625 at the age of 50, he was buried in the Pieterskerk. Located not far from the church was William Brewster with his Pilgrim Press. From here, the Pilgrims distributed pamphlets. One of the pamphlets they printed was the Perth Assembly, in which the ecclesiastical hierarchy with bishops was ridiculed. When this pamphlet found its way to the English king, James I, he considered it unacceptable. He asked the Dutch States General to intervene. The Pilgrims Brewster and Brewer were arrested and locked up in Leiden's town hall for a short period of time. Their printing materials were seized. The Pilgrims took this as a warning. At the time, there were also more and more religious conflicts in the Netherlands. Tensions were running so high that there was even a looming threat of civil war, a tragedy only to be squashed by a military coup. The Pilgrims were far from amused that the state had intervened in religious matters. They felt increasingly ill at ease in Leiden. Their children were becoming more Dutch by the day, while the adults often didn't feel at home. Thoughts turned to whether they could make a fresh start somewhere far away. At that time, the stories of explorer John Smith were wildly popular. He wrote about a new world on the other side of the ocean, full of abundance. These descriptions of the American wilderness strengthened the desire among a minority of the Pilgrims to leave. Of the 300 Pilgrims that lived in Leiden by that time, about 100 decided to commit to such an endeavor in hope of a better life, religious freedom, and new opportunities. In exchange for beaver pelts, timber, and dried fish, investors would finance the crossing of the Atlantic. 11 years after arriving in Leiden, this group of breakaway Pilgrims decided to leave. They traveled via the Dutch rivers to Delfshaven, the closest port. There is a chance this very painting shows their departure, although we'll probably never be entirely sure. The Pilgrims had to leave their boat behind in England because it had a leak. They decided to continue with just one boat, the Mayflower. In September 1620, they left from Plymouth in England, full of hope for their new promised land. Almost 2 months later, in temperatures well below freezing, the Pilgrims set anchor at today's Provincetown on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. They were met by wind-swept beaches and wild cliffs, with densely wooded plains and hills beyond. They'd expected to encounter uninhabited land, but in reality, the area had been populated by Native Americans for thousands of years. Earlier European explorers and merchants had brought infectious diseases with them, wiping out a large number of the indigenous population. On the 21st of December 1620, the Pilgrims went ashore. According to tradition, they used a large natural stepping stone to help them, which later became known as Plymouth Rock. The Pilgrims called their colony Plymouth Plantation and built several houses there. While there are no images for that time, we do have William Bradford's eyewitness account of Plymouth Plantation. Without his account, we'd know very little about the colonial founding story, and the Pilgrims would have never played such a large role in American history. Bradford wrote that the Pilgrims were greatly weakened and hungry. Almost half the Pilgrims died within 3 months of arrival. It was a disaster for the colonists. Thanks to a peace treaty with the Native Americans and the help that they gave the Pilgrims growing food, the first harvest was gathered in the autumn of 1621. Despite their great losses, the colony seemed viable. This news about the New World reached Europe and meant that many English men and women followed the Pilgrims' example. Why is it that the Pilgrims' disastrous journey had such a large impact on history? Firstly, because it's a story with universal appeal. It was about families, not adventurers, who had survived in a new world, but also because the Pilgrims were used by successive presidents to forge a sense of national unity. The Pilgrims' first harvest was elevated to a national holiday, Thanksgiving, by Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War in 1863. Thanksgiving is one of America's most important holidays. Celebrated on the fourth Thursday in November, traditional American ingredients are used such as pumpkin, corn, and turkey. Americans celebrate the abundance of the new continent. Portrayals of that first Pilgrim harvest are not representative of what really happened in 1621. Here, the Native Americans seemed like a minority. In reality, there were 90 Native Americans and only 50 Pilgrims. The Native Americans demonstrated their benevolence and their might by hunting and offering a number of deer. The story of the first harvest has been heavily romanticized. It conceals the fact that the arrival of the colonists was to the detriment of America's first inhabitants, who were massacred and robbed of their freedom and culture. In 1970, the Native American Wamsuta was invited to give a speech during a Thanksgiving dinner, marking the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims' departure from Europe. When Wamsuta submitted his speech, the white organizers deemed the contents too inappropriate, not allowing him to give it. Wamsuta decided to still hold his speech, but publicly, in Plymouth. He spoke of the dramatic consequences of the arrival of the colonists for his people. Since then, Thanksgiving has also been an official national day of mourning for many. In the long history of the Pilgrims, 2020 marks the first time that 4 nations have remembered this event: England, the United States, the Netherlands, and the Native Americans jointly held a 4-nation commemoration. This commemoration is more of a remembrance than a celebration. More than ever before, the impact of this journey and the different perspectives on it are commemorated. In their quest for freedom 400 years ago, the Pilgrims crossed literal and figurative boundaries, and doing so restricting the freedom of others. An exhibition at Museum de Lakenhal tells this story. Pilgrims to America and the Limits of Freedom is on view from the 2nd of June until the 13th of September, 2020.